Okay, we are going to continue with our talk sessions for Friday morning. So please have a seat. As for the other sessions, we want to encourage certainly trainees also to ask questions. There are also microphones in the back of the room, if that is better. We're going to start the session with Tricia Xiao, excessive neural replay of aversive and uncertain options predict human irrational decision making.
Hi, I'm Tricia, very glad to be here today to share about my work. So I'm talking about a neural replay study linked to decision making. So in daily life, we often have to make decisions about uncertain options, and for me, an example of a decision I had to make was about my travel arrangements when I came from London to Boston for CCN. And there were two airlines that I could take. One of them was JetBlue, and the other was Delta, and so I considered a couple of things when I was making this decision. So one of them is the value of the options. In this case, JetBlue seemed to have a ticket that was actually a bit more pricey than Delta. And the other thing that I considered was actually the certainty of receiving the intended outcome. And here it's about whether I would get to my destination on time, given the airline that I take. And from recent news, you might have heard that Delta seems to be quite unreliable in dealing with disruptions from that CrowdStrike failure that happened a couple of weeks ago. And so weighing on these two things, on value and certainty, I chose to fly with JetBlue. So considering option value and probabilities to make decisions is pretty much how we generally make choices. And this has been studied for decades and modeled in behavioral economics. However, what we still don't really know is how this decision process manifests in the brain. For example, how we integrate or weigh these information together to inform choice. And in other words, we know little about how people deliberate in neural terms. So what is happening when deliberation biases occur, for example, in mental health conditions? So a window into understanding what the brain is doing during the deliberation is neural replay, and this is a neuroactivity first characterized from rodent studies, where the sequential reactivation of place cells in the hippocampus was found to support spatial navigation. And now this activity is also known to be involved in other types of cognition beyond space. So now we also believe that humans have a very similar mechanism of replay, which we can quantify from the decoding of sequential reactivation of states with MEG. And so in this specific study that I'm sharing with you here today, we asked whether replay could be a mechanism that we use when we deliberate about outcomes and uncertainties when we make decisions. So what we did was to ask participants to make choices with certain and risky options, and we varied the outcomes and probabilities linked to these options across the trials. So under the hood, each of these option paths with different outcomes and probabilities were associated with different sequential states of decodable stimuli, and this lets us to quantify the replay of each of these option paths when people were deliberating about them before they make their choice. So the first basic question that we had was really just, does replay even occur during the time of deliberation before choice? And we find that yes, participants did show replay of the options before they make their choices. And here I focus on forward replay, meaning the state-to-state transition happens in a forward manner. And we find that people had the highest level of replay when the interval between the state-to-state reactivations was at 40 milliseconds, which is a lag rate that was similar to other human replay studies. So now that we have found replay during deliberation, that we know that it actually occurs, the next question we asked was whether this deliberation time replay was actually capturing what we think participants were thinking about when they make their choices. So for instance, we consider outcome values of the options when we make our choices, and so does replay even reflect these outcome values that we are thinking about? And what we find is an effect of outcome value of the options on replay strength, where there was a higher replay for paths that ended up in more aversive outcomes, and this suggested that participants were actually more concerned about aversive options over beneficial ones before they make their choice. The next thing that we considered when people were making decisions was about how likely we are to get these options, these outcomes. And in other words, it's about the probability of getting the outcomes from the choice that you make. And so we asked whether replay could also capture this. And what we find is a relationship of replay strength and probability of the option path, where the options that were close to the uncertain 50% chance of receipt were actually being replayed more than the more certain options. And if we kind of recode probability into uncertainty, we indeed see that there is a positive effect on uncertainty on replay, where more uncertain paths were being replayed more than the certain ones. So overall, we find that previously I showed participants were not only concerned about aversive options while they are deliberating, but also seem to be quite concerned about uncertain options before they make their choices. So lastly, what we wanted to know if this sort of deliberative replay that captures these choice components of value and uncertainty, does it even affect choice at all? So for instance, does replay help us to make good choices, or when does it help us to make bad choices? So to quantify whether a choice is good or bad, we define it in terms of rationality, where we can estimate the rationality of a choice with a comparison of the expected value of the choice options, where expected value is determined by the product of probability and outcome. And so choosing the option with a higher expected value is a rational choice, else is an irrational choice. And so what we did was to probe how deliberative replay would lead to rational choice or irrational choice. And what we find is that if you focus on the purple line on the graph as compared to the green one, you can see that the modulation of replay to aversive outcomes, which we saw earlier, of higher replay for more aversive paths, was actually stronger when participants were about to make irrational over rational choices. So in other words, participants were very preoccupied with aversive options during deliberation, and they ended up making irrational choices. As for uncertainty, we see a similar effect of replay and uncertainty, where the modulation of replay to uncertain outcomes of higher replay for more uncertain options was stronger when participants were about to make irrational over rational choices. In other words, making irrational choices was not only predated by participants being quite preoccupied with aversive options, but also very uncertain ones. So in summary, we find that humans do use replay when they make decisions. We find that replay seems to be an activity that tracks the bad and uncertain outcomes, and exaggerated tracking of these negative and uncertain outcomes drive irrational choice. So because of the time limit, I wasn't able to speak about individual differences of decisional replay and its effect of choice, but do talk to me about it if you want to know more about it. So I'd just like to thank my collaborators, Ray and Jess, and my supervisor Tobias, for their help in this study, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful talk. So the replay is much faster than the deliberation. Do you have any sense for, or what do you think how those two different processes relate? And maybe did you measure conscious deliberation processes in your subjects and how that relates to the replay?
Sorry, I really can't hear the question here.
So the replay is much faster than the deliberation, the conscious deliberation that people probably do in your task. So the question is, how do you think those two relate? And do you have any data on what people actually thought about in your task versus what they replayed?
So the data that I didn't show here was actually we correlated these replay activity with different levels of mental health states that we collected from the participants. And we find that obsession compulsion actually showed that these individuals with high obsession compulsion showed an even more exaggerated modulation of replay linked to the value before they make irrational choices. So it kind of in a way we're thinking about it is that it kind of reflects that in OCD, the patients tend to be very, very focused on very negative outcomes that may or may not happen, and we think that that reflects a little bit of that behavior in replay.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, but we're going to continue anyway. The next talk is by Hong Tu. You can read the title, Paradoxical Replay Maintains Balance and Robust Representations of Task Functions.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Hongtu Chen. I'm from Vandermeer Lab at Dartmouth. Today, I'm going to talk about paradoxical replay and how it maintains balanced and robust representations of text structure. So we know replay is a pervasive phenomenon that's being observed in both rodents and humans, and it is thought as a powerful mechanism to enable efficient learning from limited experience. Not only validated in biological systems, the idea of efficient learning through replay has also been demonstrated in recent success of artificial neural networks. So what exactly is the functional role of replay in learning? Currently, there are 4 main hypothesized functions. They are value function updating and memory consolidation in offline replay. Also, there are episodic retrieval and planning in online replays. Despite their specific hypothesis about what replay does, all of these theories share a common prediction. The content of replay should be what you have recently just done or what you are about to do. And there have been many, many studies of replay content that support this view. However, in contrast to the established view, several studies have shown that under certain conditions, the content of replay reflects non-recent past experience. For example, replay has been found to reflect options that were last chosen recently, or remote past experience was more replay than recent past experience. This so-called paradoxical replay phenomenon presents puzzling results that are inconsistent with current theories. So the key question here is, why does paradoxical replay occur? And the short answer is that it is useful when animals employ certain task representations under unbalanced experience. I'm going to unpack this point in my talk. To understand the computational role of paradoxical replay, we started by modeling a contextual discrimination task, where in context 1, the choice of left is more rewarded, and in context 2, right is more rewarded. Building on prior works from Andrew Sachs and Chris Summersfield's lab, we trained a 3-layer feed-forward neural networks with gradient descent to solve this task. This network takes input of choice and context, passing through a single hidden layer of value nonlinearity function, and finally predicts the outcome. Then we explore 2 learning strategies that trade off between learning speed and robustness. First, we have rich learning, which adapts slowly but is more robust to input noise. On the other hand, there is lazy learning, which learns fast but is more fragile to input noise. Rich and lazy learning also differ in the structure of their text representations. Rich learning develops a representation that's specific to the text structure. In contrast, lazy learning forms a representation that's agnostic to the task. So we just think that rich and lazy learning contrast in their text performance and representations. But unlike the balanced data distribution that we have seen so far, in experimental texts where paradoxical replay was observed, animals often repeatedly chose more rewarded options, which lead to an imbalance in their experience. So we want to understand how rich and lazy learning will respond to unbalanced experience. To mirror real-world conditions, in simulations, we train both networks primarily with inputs of rewarded outcomes. Under this condition, we found that the slowly adapting rich networks struggle to match the performance of faster learning lazy networks, even after a substantial amount of training. By introducing paradoxical replay, essentially balancing the data distribution with inputs of less experienced outcomes, rich networks can achieve performance comparable to lazy learning. So we learned that the text performance of rich learning is impaired under unbalanced experience. However, paradoxical replay can counteract those negative effects. On the other hand, lazy learning is not affected by unbalanced experience. So this leads to a testable hypothesis in biological data. If we consider a spectrum from rich to lazy learning, we should expect to see more paradoxical replay in richer neural representations and less paradoxical replay in lazier neural representations. But we still got a problem to solve. How can we quantify rich versus lazy representations in a way that's comparable between artificial systems and the brain? One effective approach is to compare the representational distance between different choices. So again, in simulations, we found that rich networks show larger representational distance between different choices in the embedding of their hidden unit activations compared to lazy networks. So this suggests that we can refine our hypothesis. Empirically, we can expect that animals or recording sessions with larger representational distance would show higher levels of paradoxical replay. We tested this hypothesis using the carrier datasets, where paradoxical replay was found and rats performed a contextual discrimination test on the teammates. We quantified the richness in hippocampal neurons by the representational distance between left and right running trials on the overlapping segment. We then correlated our measure of richness in neural representations with the paradoxical replay bias in the data and found a striking positive correlations. So each point on the figure on the right shows a data point for single sessions. So this means that sessions with richer neural representations indeed show a greater bias to a paradoxical replay. In summary, we started by rich and lazy learning strategies, and using simulations, we showed that paradoxical replay can protect rich learning from detrimental effects under unbalanced experience. We then hypothesized that richer neural representations would show more paradoxical replay, and this hypothesis was then supported by our analysis of neural data. So altogether, our result refines the notion of consolidations in complementary system theory and suggests a key function of biological replay, which is to strengthen those task representations that are more vulnerable to memory interference. And finally, I want to thank people from Vandermeer Lab and people who gave great feedbacks. And I'm going to present this book at poster C93 in a poster session just right after. And come find me if you want to know more about paradoxical replay. Thank you.
You're playing paradoxical, the function of paradoxical replay rather in a conventional context, right? I mean, that is kind of what you want. You want to strengthen weak representation.
Yes,
So
yes.
is it then paradoxical?
Yeah, so the naming is not perfect. I totally agree. So we call it paradoxical because we want to differentiate from what current theory suggests. So we give a name of paradoxical replay, and we can call it maybe, temporary remote path replay. That's fine, but yeah, I'm welcome to any better naming, and come find me if you have better suggestions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the talks are going surprisingly smooth. Everyone is very well trained to keep the talks within the allowed presentation time. We're going to continue with them anyway, because otherwise we would now lead a relatively large gap. The next goal is from Christopher Gunstrom. Multi-goal spatial navigation is mediated by predictive representations with episodic replay in the human brain.
All right, so today I'll present a project where we investigated neural correlates of reinforcement learning models applied to flexible navigation behavior. So here's the problem I'm going to address. So imagine after this session, you decide to check out a restaurant a few blocks away. Now, after having lunch there, perhaps you decide to go back to your accommodation at Kendall Hotel before finally returning back to the lecture hall. In this naturalistic example, a goal location is only active for one navigation episode at a time, requiring dynamic updating of route preferences. So how do we solve this problem? And what are the neural mechanisms of flexible navigation behavior during this kind of rapid goal switching? So our approach to study these mechanisms is to compare reinforcement learning models to observe behavioral and neural data. So on the left here, you can see 3 example classes of RL models that lie on a continuum between flexibility and efficiency. So model-based agents are considered to be flexible but computationally inefficient, while the class of model-free algorithms are considered efficient but not very flexible. And recently, one paper by Decote et al. 2022 found that successor representation, which is an RL model that is imbued with predictive state representations and lie somewhere in between model-based and model-free in terms of flexibility, is best fit to navigation behavior in rats and humans. However, this task only manipulated changes in the transition structure of the environment, and the goal location remained constant throughout the experiment. So still unknown if these models can account for behavior and neural activity in flexible navigation tasks with rapidly changing goal locations. So to investigate this question, we used a naturalistic navigation paradigm where participants are performing a taxicab task. So participants navigate a large environment in first person. On each trial, they either need to pick up a new passenger or take the passenger to one of 2 consecutive goal locations. On the left here, you can see where 12 different goals are dispersed throughout the environment. And to detect neural signals with higher precision, we opted to maximize the number of sessions where we collected fMRI data on this task. So we ended up with 15 participants with around 4.5 hours of bold data spread across 6 to 7 experimental sessions. So our analytical approach here will be to have these 3 classes of RL models perform the same problem sets as the human participants. We'll then fit free parameters of these models to human behavior and select the best fitting model. And finally, we'd use that model to investigate neural signatures of core computations. To facilitate the model fitting, we downsample the environment to discrete states and salient decision units. So the continuous environment was transformed into 39 states based on hallways, junctions, and goal locations. And the color identified here, a goal state in the top-down view on the left, directly corresponds to the same color of the same goal state on the right. So there's a lot to unpack here, so I won't kind of go through all of it. But so like I've already mentioned, we use 3 different broad classes of RL models, which included a model-free Q-learner, model-based value iteration, MBV, and successor representation. But just to summarize here, so each model embodied different kinds of representations and updates. So the model-free RL agent stores cached state action values in a value table. The model-based agent also learns an explicit transition structure of the environment, while the successor representation model learns a successor matrix, which stores each state in terms of the future discounted occupancy of all the other states. But the main take-home here is that each of these models were given the same starting and goal as the human participants, and the RL agents update their internal representations following each state transition. And to facilitate the fact that we have 12 different goals, we implemented separate reward vectors queued by the current active goal. So the first thing we looked at was to compare use task performance of the human participant with that of the different RL models. So on the y-axis here, we can see how much each model in human deviates from optimality. So higher values here means that you have worse performance. So the first thing we can see is that the human performance was not significantly different from that of the performance achieved by our successor representation model. The model-based agents were significantly better at task performance than the humans, while the model-free Q-learner was significantly worse in terms of performance. So it's an interesting start, but we're also interested to see which model here is best fit to human choices. So what you can see here is an example of a trajectory through the graph network in one example trial. And highlighted here is state 14, where the agents and the humans have 4 different possible actions. So for each model, we can compare the human action to the model-generated action at each state transition. And by using maximum likelihood estimation, we fit 3 parameters of each model. And then finally, we can compute a BIC score per model fit, where lower score means better model fit. So here we show that for majority of participants, the SR version model is best fitting. And as you also might have noticed, our successor representation model here also has a DINA component. I also thought it was a replay component, which I'll explain more about towards the end of the talk. So just to explain in a little bit more detail here, so we're particularly interested in the idea that flexible navigation might be guided by a policy-dependent successor representation. And the key representational structure here is the successor matrix, which summarizes the relationships between the current state and the future states. And each row in this matrix represents the discounted future occupancy or the likelihood of reaching future states from the current states under the current policy. And on the right, you can see what the successor values are for state 14 after some amount of training. And not surprisingly, the successor values are higher for adjoining states than for the more distal states, because you're more likely to occupy those next. So in some sense, this row of the SR can be viewed as population-level activity for a given state. So what we did next was to use the best fitting models of the SR dyna and the fitted parameters for each participant, and we can then begin to investigate the neural signatures of this model in our naturalistic navigation task. And we hypothesized that the predictive state values will be present in hippocampus. So for each state transition here, we can extract the current state row for the SR matrix and average or sum that vector to get a scalar value. And we enter this to a univariate GLM as a parametric regressor, and then what we found is that the anterior hippocampus is dynamically tracking these predictive state values during the task. And we're also interested in kind of the updating of these state values and whether we could identify neural signatures of this computation. So that the updating here is known as successor prediction error, and it's derived from the difference between the current state row and the future state row in the SR matrix. So in our whole brain analysis, with the same GLM approach I just described, we identified a network of brain regions strongly co-activated by these successor prediction errors. This included occipital place area, superior parietal cortex, parahippocampal place area, and retrosplenial complex, also thought of as kind of a navigation network. And interestingly, this network was also recently described as a place memory network by Steele et al. 21, and using the same localizer data from our lab also show a strikingly similar network when contrasting scene memory with face memory in a separate group of participants. So finally here, as I alluded to before, our SR model also incorporates a form of replay, namely episodic reactivation. So we were interested in if this relatively simple replay mechanism also mapped onto brain activity at trial onsets. So at each goal Q onset, for each goal-directed trial, our successful representation model replayed a single episode from a memory buffer. This episode contained the trajectory from the last time you visited the same goal as currently queued, as seen in the schematic on the left in the green trajectory. And in the middle, you can also see a time course of what these replay-induced successor prediction errors looked like. And what we found is that posterior hippocampus was correlated with the magnitude of this replay-induced successor prediction errors. So in summary here, what I've shown today is that these predictive representations with episodic reactivation were best fit to rapid goal switching navigation behavior. And we found 3 different signatures in the fMRI signal that corresponds to internal components of this model. First was the predictive state values that correlate with anterior hippocampal activity. Secondly, the updating of these values reflected in place memory network. And finally, we found that successor prediction errors induced by replay to onset on navigation were correlated with posterior hippocampus. So our data suggests, on the basis of both behavior and concurrent brain activity, plausible mechanisms of flexible navigation. Thank you for listening, and thanks to everyone in Epstein Lab. And right after this, I have my poster if you want to hear more on this topic.
Thank you for the great talk. I have one question about the comparison between the successor representation and your recording. So you used the fMRI for the recording, and then probably the resolution might be some second level or millisecond level. So that means each state, I mean, each abstractive state might have some multiple recording. And how did you aggregate that recording to compare with the successor representation? Because you use successor representation on the very abstracted, like graph structure environment. So could you elaborate more about how did you compare with those kind of recording and your successor representation?
Yeah, it's quite hard to hear up here, but so I mean, with the fMRI bowl data, I mean, so we downsample the behavior to this graph network, right? So that is kind of what the models are performing the task on the graph state network. So we downsample the behavior on there, and we also, when we do get the neural signatures, we look at the state kind of level. But we're not extracting, like, we're not separating out all those different states and look at the individual kind of state level representations. But I don't know if so that's not what we're doing, but that's something that we're talked about, would be really nice to do. But the problem is you have quite some bias in how much each state is sampled. So participants are more likely to go through the center of the environment, for instance, so those states are overrepresented.
I have one quick follow-up. So does it mean that the state in the fMRI recording in each state are similar, or is it different when they enter to the state and then when they escape from the state?
Yeah, I can't quite hear, but maybe we can talk after, and
I will ask later.
Hopefully explain better. Thanks.
Hi. I have a question about the learning, how you learn the successor representation. As you know, we know it's highly dependent on the policy that's being followed. And I was wondering, was it a random policy, or did you use, let's say, the empirical policies that the subject actually followed during the experiment? And then how does that relate to the neural signals of SR learning?
Yeah, so this is so the SR is policy dependent, right? So it's kind of learned on the basis of the behavior of whatever the participants are, how they're behaving. So we didn't do any analysis on like a random walk SR, but that would also be interesting in itself. It's something we're thinking about to compare, both in terms of like behavioral prediction. So is the policy dependent SR different from the random walk SR in terms of predicting behavior? But also, would it give rise to like differences in the like the successor state values, and could we see if that's also correlated with the signal we're observing? So it's a really good point and something we want to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great talk. Appreciated the experimental demo. The humans in your experiments are operating in a high-dimensional visual and action space, while you're discretizing this space for the models such that it's, you're segmenting in some way.
Yeah.
There's been a big push to have models operating in high-dimensional continuous spaces more recently. But you could conversely ask, how do humans behave if you were to segment the action space and the sensory space in a similar way? I've seen this in relatively low-dimensional settings where it's a pretty small graph structure. But I'm curious if you have data or speculation about how humans behave in a kind of discretized state space that is quite large, as in your experiment.
Yeah, I mean, there's some other people who've done really cool work on decision-making in really large state spaces. I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of interested in going forward, is that how do we go from like continuous experience into maybe these kind of more discretized like decision units we can actually form plans and so on. So it's kind of a partially hand-wavy way that we've defined these states currently, but it would be super interesting to have some other kind of model-derived, some deep learning approach, something to how we actually go from this continuous kind of high-dimensional stream to this more low-dimensional representation. But yeah, I'd love to talk about it more later as well.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to continue with our next speaker, Ai-Feng Tong, learning and use of reward-related representations across cortex and time. Success.
Hi everyone, I'm Ai-Feng from the University of Oxford. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to present my research assessing reward-related representations or human electrocorticography activity patterns related to reward expectations during learning. So this type of human electrophysiology research is possible given the generous participation of patients with epilepsy who undergo surgery for seizure localization with intracranial recordings. So for the first part of this talk, I want to discuss the current literature that would suggest that similar cues over time would be reflected by representations that are reusable. And so from human and rodent literature, we know that structures in the medial temporal lobe, or MTL, such as the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, represent structure in the environment. And so similarities in the environment, spatial or non-spatial, elicit similar activation patterns in this region. And the conserved activity patterns can come in many forms, such as similar activity amplitude or repeated sequences of spiking activity. And we know this extends beyond the MTL as well. And when we learn to reinforce behaviors, we might expect similar patterns of reward-related representations. Now, reward-related representations have been found to be distributed across the brain, as shown here, and this is just some of the brain regions. But we do not really know the extent to which all of these representations are reused during the reinforcement of behaviors. And so we explored the question, when we reinforce rewarding choices between two scenes, how much are we reusing reward-related representations, and where does this occur in the brain? And one hypothesis is that reward-related representations we form in one scene are not reused in another, because reward is differently represented for each scene, and we increasingly represent the distinction between the two scenes. The alternative hypothesis is that these representations are reused when reward information can be transferred between scenes. So we explored the similarity in representations of reward expectation throughout learning. And here, for the first time, to our knowledge, we use human electrocorticography to survey how different brain regions represent reward expectations and reuse this throughout learning. And so in an environment where reward outcomes change, a strategy for learning is to form an expectation for reward based on prior rewarded choices, rather than making random choices. And we modeled this prediction of reward with a Bayesian framework. And when I say reward expectation, I refer to the mean expected reward probability of a Bayesian learner. So we trained human subjects with a two-alternative forced choice task with reversal and reward between two spatial scenes in a series of blocks. And the learning phase of one block is shown here. In each block, either beach or forest was selected as the spatial scene for the first 60 trials in scene 1. And then the second 60 trials were carried in the other spatial scene, scene 2. And on the bottom are examples of a couple of trials. So subjects were tasked to learn the most rewarding choices of two different item sets, face and building, it's shown on the top example here, and cutlery and animal, shown on the bottom. And with the Bayesian learner, the reward expectation is updated with each choice that is made, indicated here by the filled circles, and the reward outcome indicated by the open circles. And the Bayesian learner learns the distribution of reward probability separately for each item set in each scene for each block. And so we could assess the extent to which representations of task-related information are reused when rewarding choices are reinforced with a no reversal item set. Whereas in the reversal item set, the most frequently rewarded item changes between scene 1 and scene 2. And so we would expect the subjects would not reuse reward representations between the two scenes. And so 11 subjects were trained over 4 blocks over 2.4 sessions on average, performed on different days. And we tracked learning at each trial using the absolute difference between the expectation for reward and the true reward probability, which I refer to as the absolute value of the reward expectation error. A block example is shown on the top left. And within a block, subjects demonstrated a change in the sum or total reward expectation error from scene 1 to scene 2. And subjects that demonstrated more efficient learning had a greater decrease in reward expectation error over blocks. So to examine the change in learning efficiency, we correlated the change in total reward expectation error with the block number using a mixed effects linear regression model. And over blocks, we found the reward expectation error progressively improved or decreased, indicating more efficient learning when there was no reward reversal and not when there was a reward reversal. And based on prior studies of behavior guided by rules, we hypothesized that when reward information is relevant to the task, it would be actively represented in a way that can influence choices in learning. And so we measured electrocorticography signals across temporal cortex and prefrontal cortex as human subjects completed this task. And we examined the representation of reward expectation by running a regression where at each time point we predicted the reward expectation from the amplitude of the electrode signal. And we captured the representation of reward expectation from the regression coefficients. So we anticipated the representation changes over time. And so a representation is measured for each context condition in each block across sessions. And so an example is shown here where you see the representation of reward expectation before the choice is made at time 0. And this is across electrodes on the y-axis and lock to choice on the x-axis. If representations are not reused, we expect similarity to decrease or stay the same over blocks, whereas if representations are reused, we would expect similarity to increase or be higher. And so next, we looked for whether these representations are reused in human electrophysiology. And at each time point, we measured the similarity of representations of reward expectation between the two scenes and computed the contribution of each brain region to the similarity by an ablation procedure. And this allowed us to investigate precisely when and where in the brain representations are reused and in which scenarios. We found that within 1 second to making a choice, the representations of reward expectation from one scene are reused from the prior scene when rewarding choices are reinforced in the second scene in the no reversal condition. And so when we take the mean similarity in the 1 second period before a choice is made, we find that in the MTL, there is evidence of reuse of representations in the no reversal condition. And this is not seen in the anterior temporal lobe or the lateral prefrontal cortex, but it is also seen in the it's not seen in the anterior temporal lobe or lateral prefrontal cortex, but seen in the orbital frontal cortex. And then to explore whether this is a mechanism for learning, we can measure whether the reuse increases over blocks. And we probed the behavioral relevance of the representations of reward expectation during learning by measuring the association between the similarity of the representations between scene 1 and scene 2 and learning. So to measure this, we estimated how much the sum of the reward expectation error over trials changed between scene 1 and scene 2, which we refer to as the delta total reward expectation error or our learning error signal. And we expect learning corresponds to a reduced or negative change in delta from scene 1 to scene 2, and an increase in the similarity of representations seen with a decrease in this change in total reward expectation error would support hypothesis 2, that the reuse of representations facilitate learning. And this is what we see in the anterior temporal lobe. And we found that the reuse of representations or the similarity in representations in ATL only increases with learning over blocks, and this is not seen elsewhere. And so to summarize, we find that there are 2 separate regions that have reusable representations of reward expectation. In the third region, there's actually a change in the reuse of representations, and that's in the anterior temporal lobe. And so what this might suggest is that there are these different states of reactivation of representations, and this is a topic of future research. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my advisors across the University of Oxford, University of Washington, and the NIH. Thank you.
Okay, our final talk of this session is Annika Leuwe, Sleep-Inspired Insight Pre-Registered Study.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to conclude the session and contribute the first sleep talk of CCN this year. This is work done with my shared first author Maren Petzka, our research assistant Maria, and my supervisor Nico, who you've seen around here as an organizer. So The phenomenon of having an insight or aha moment has attracted researchers' attention and interest for about 100 years. And while it is still debated what exact cognitive and neural phenomena and mechanisms underlie insight, it is agreed upon that insight involves an abrupt nonlinear task improvement. And generally it is assumed that this requires a restructuring of existing task representations that then leads to a novel problem solution. An important milestone to understanding insight will be to identify the factors that facilitate insight. And one such candidate is sleep, since sleep is linked to memory consolidation and also the restructuring of memories. The most prominent paper linking sleep to insight comes from Ulrich Wagner from now 20 years ago, where participants did a mathematical insight task where they were given sequences of mathematical problems that they could solve easier and faster if they had an insight about a hidden rule. They found that after a full night of sleep, participants were more than twice as likely to have insight into this hidden rule. Similarly, Lacaux and colleagues in a more recent study using the same mathematical insight task but a daytime nap intervention found that participants that reached N1 sleep, which is the first sleep phase, were significantly more likely to have an insight after the nap. However, other studies have not found such a relation or did not find a difference between quiet rest and sleep. And in order to investigate this further and also investigate potentially differential effects of different sleep phases on insight, we set out to pre-register and conceptually replicate this Lacaux paper using their methods but our own hidden rule insight task. So our two main questions were, one, does sleep and particularly N1 sleep increase post-nap insight? And two, what features of the sleep EEG signal could best predict insight? This is the task that we use. It is our hidden rule insight task that is called perceptual spontaneous strategy switch task, aka PST, there's the hidden rule. It is a random dot motion task where I guess most of you know, but as you can see on the left, on a given trial, participants see a cloud of colored moving dots that move to the four corners of the screen with varying coherence. Color is just changing randomly and has no information, and participants' task is to learn to pay attention to the motion direction and classify the dot cloud based on the predominant motion direction. Participants are given two response buttons, left and right, and have to learn to map the diagonal motion directions onto these two buttons. Importantly, we never mention that there's any rule, and we don't give them any sort of feature relevance. They have to learn this themselves via feedback. This is how a trial looks like. Participants see the dots, they then press, and whether they press correctly or incorrectly, they see a happy or sad smiley. The insight comes in after about half the task when the color starts correlating with the motion diagonals and therefore also the correct response button, meaning that whenever the cloud is moving on this diagonal and orange, the left key will be correct, and when it's moving on that diagonal or purple, the right key will be correct. The color rule is really easy, and if people have an insight about this hidden color rule, they can solve the task much easier and faster. The general task structure is as follows. We have a first training block where people get 100% motion coherence to make sure they all learn the stimulus response mapping. In the second training block, we introduce more noise into the color, so in the motion, and then we introduce all noise levels in the third block, and after the first block of block 4, we introduce the color correlation, meaning that in all these orange blocks, people can, in principle, have an insight about the hidden color rule. After about half the task, people get 20 minutes to nap, and we measure EEG only in these 20 minutes. This is based on Lacaux's methods. We then take these 20 minutes of nap time and classify people into 3 different sleep stages, either awake if they did not fall asleep during the 20 minutes, or in 1 or in 2 based on their EEG sleep signature. Then having these different sleep groups, we can look at whether they have differential effects on insight. And this is what we find. The gray bar on the left is our baseline insight ratio that we derived from a previous study where we used the same task without any break. Our awake group is at 56% insight, which is very close to the 50% baseline ratio. The N1 group has 64% insight after the nap, and the N2 group, 86%. So we find that in our study, N2 sleep increases insight. which is at odds with what Lacan found, who found a beneficial effect of N1 sleep and even a detrimental effect of N2 sleep. To investigate this further and also look at the electrophysiological signatures of insight, we investigated the aperiodic EEG activity. This aperiodic activity is quantified by the spectral slope of the power spectrum. So it describes the frequency power dependence, where you get a steeper slope with decreasing power and increasing frequency. The reason we think this is interesting is that the spectral slope decreases with increasing sleep depth, meaning that you have a steeper slope during deeper sleep. Our own computational work found that regularization and noise are beneficial for insight. And while there's no direct link between neural network parameters and electrophysiological parameters, both regularization and noise have been indirectly linked to aperiodic activity. As expected, we find that the spectral slope differs between the 3 sleep groups, with the N2 group having the steepest slope and the wake group the most shallow slope. So we find that the spectral slope is a continuous, more fine-grained measure of sleep depth, but does it relate to insight? To investigate this, we use a nested modeling approach where at first we compare a baseline model that predicts insight based on only sleep stage as a predictor with a model that also includes a spectral slope. And we find that including this predictor, spectral slope, improves the model fit, as you can see by the darker color in the ASC change, meaning that the model fits better, especially over frontocentral electrodes. We then compare this model with the most parsimonious model that only includes the spectral slope and find that this model is the best overall fitting model across all channels. So we find that the spectral slope actually predicts insight above just sleep stages, and this is driven mainly by frontocentral electrodes, and a steeper spectral slope means that people are more likely to gain insight after the nap. So to summarize, we found that in our study, N2 sleep increased insight and that the aperiodic EEG activity during the nap could predict this insight after the nap. This was driven by a steeper spectral slope linked to insight likelihood. All in all, this suggests that deeper sleep is needed for insight. And furthermore, we find that the spectral slope might reflect regularization, which could be an important factor in generating insight. With that, I want to thank you for listening, thank my collaborators in my lab, and if you have any questions or want to discuss regularization, you can come to my poster in about 50 minutes.
I think it would be impossible for me to fall asleep in an experimental setting like this.
The question was whether it would be difficult to fall asleep during an experiment like this. Was that the question?
I think I had a follow-up, but please, maybe you have something to say about this. That would be interesting.
I didn't understand you. The acoustics are so bad here.
Let's just go with that.
So sort of to ensure that people could fall asleep easier, we asked them to sleep 30% less the night before coming and to not drink any caffeine before coming. They all came at 1 p.m., did half the task, and then were given these 20 minutes to sleep. We did try to ensure to pick the most comfortable armchair at IKEA for napping, and then this like EEG cabin, so it's like a noise-shielded, complete dark cabin, and most people, I guess, are sleep deprived enough that they can fall asleep, but I think about 2/3 of our participants in general fell asleep, and the rest were just classified as awake.
I guess my question is around, I imagine that there are lots of factors that affect whether or not someone will be able to fall asleep and the level of sleep that they'll be able to reach in this kind of setting. And I'm wondering how you disentangle those many factors. For example, I might be a very anxious person, and that leads to my inability to fall asleep and achieve deep sleep, and how you disentangle, for example, my trait anxiety from those kinds of other factors.
Yeah, we don't, is the answer, because we're not actually interested in what your propensity to fall asleep or reach a certain sleep stage means for your insight, but just the general sleep stage alone and what sort of processes during the sleep phase might lead to this insight phenomenon after.
It's very helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm worried that whatever those varying factors that we were just discussing might have an effect not just after the sleep phase, but also before the sleep phase. So I'm curious whether you saw any differences in the participants' behavior prior to the sleep phase between the groups.
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't. And we also checked, there's some people that gain insight before the nap, and there's no relation between what sleep phase they reach after having the insight or no.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
If I understood correctly, participants were asked to sleep less prior to coming to the study. One thing I was wondering then was how would the performance of participants who are not sleep deprived compared to the different groups of participants who were sleep deprived and then had different kinds of sleeps during the experiment?
Also a great question. There's no difference, luckily, because we have this study from before where we had no break at all, and it statistically does not differ from performance of these people. We also did psychomotor vigilance tasks before they did the nap and afterwards to sort of make sure that they're at the same attention level and there's no like sleep inertia effect.
Okay, then I would like to thank you. I would like to close the session and thank all speakers again. And